Business Link Pacific's Professional Development Advisor, and one of my roles at BLP is to host our monthly webinar series, which usually takes place on the second or third Thursday of each month. And our current series is actually focused on business advisor skills. However, this particular webinar is an extra special webinar that we're hosting in collaboration with CERT New Zealand, also CERT Vanuatu, hopefully if our speaker can get to us today, and PaCSON, and it's during Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Cybersecurity Awareness Month is an internationally recognised campaign, and it's held each October to help people learn more about the importance of cybersecurity. Increasingly, cybersecurity is an important issue for all of us and for business, especially for business, as we're all users of the internet. And of course, now in particular, we are deepening our reliance and use of the internet as our main mode of communication, particularly since COVID-19. Now, before I introduce you to our guest today, let me quickly just run through the format of the webinar so that we're all on the same page for the next hour. So now that we've started, we are recording the webinar, and that recording will be available afterwards if you want to recap on anything, or if you want to share it with your colleagues. It will be saved on the BLP website along with all our other webinars. And I do encourage you to use these resources to either recap on what you've already seen as a participant in a webinar, or indeed to extend your knowledge across some of the wider business advisory areas. There's some great topics that we've covered, so really do encourage you to go and have a look at some of those webinars. If you haven't done so already, can I please ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off, as this does help to make sure that everyone can hear the speaker and it prevents disruption. Please do feel free, though, to ask questions throughout the webinar by using the chat box. Now, you'll find that in the top right-hand corner of your window. We do welcome your thoughts, we welcome your comments, we welcome your questions throughout the webinar. And there will be a specific time at the end for questions. So as we go through, if something occurs to you, please do feel free to pop a comment in the comment box, in the chat box as we go, or during the question time if you wish. Okay, so let me now introduce to you our guests. Now, firstly, I'm not sure whether Dr. Jeffrey Garai will be able to join us to the webinar today. Jeff has been called away to some urgent business that's going on with his employer, CERT Vanuatu, at the moment, but hopefully he'll be able to join us later on in the webinar. Now, Jeff is a very, very key person. He's chair of the PaCSON Awareness Raising Group, so I do hope he can join us. However, I'd also like to introduce to you who is here today with us. I'd like to introduce you to Sam Leggett, who is currently working as a Threat Incident Response Analyst with CERT New Zealand. That's the Cyber Security Emergency Response Team. Now, he's been with CERT New Zealand since April this year, and prior to that he has worked as an analyst within Trade Me's fraud prevention team for almost 5 years. So I'm sure he's picked up lots of tips and many different fraud issues in that role. He's recently completed the SIMS4 training, which stands for Coordinated Incident Management System, and he's previously also completed papers in computer science and cybersecurity with Victoria University in Wellington. So, Sam, welcome to you, and looking forward to this discussion. It's going to be really interesting hearing from you, and fantastic topic to talk about, very important one for businesses. So thanks very much. I'll hand over to you now. I don't believe Jeff's been able to make it just yet, so I'll hand straight over to you, Sam.
Cool, thanks very much, Barbara, and thank you to everyone at Business Link Pacific for having me along to speak today. It's a great opportunity, and I'm pretty keen to get that good message of cybersecurity out there as far and wide as we can. I do have a colleague here with me at the moment, Clay Aiken, who's our Pacific liaison, and he has kindly offered to run through the slides that Jeff was going to talk to in the case that Jeff wasn't able to make it. So if you can all see my slide, the PaCSON presentation for Business Link Pacific 2021, I will let Clay take over and talk about those slides now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Clay from CERT NZ, and happy International Cyber Awareness Month to all of you. I will try to do my best to do justice to Jeff's presentation, and hopefully he will be able to join later in the session to help answer some questions. I also need to give my apologies that I will need to sneak out halfway through the session as well. But you will be left at the very least in Sam's very capable and expert hands. So please start thinking immediately of the toughest questions that you can possibly come up with. So we're really appreciative to Barbara and the Business Link Pacific community. Thank you so much for having us here. Small and medium enterprises, as well as business advisors, play a strong role in building cyber resilience across the region and spreading it, both within their own networks, within their own organizations, across their customers, but also in the wider Pacific community. Of course, being small and medium enterprises, resourcing is always a challenge, and learning and understanding some good practices can also be quite daunting. Being a non-technical person in a technical organization, I can definitely speak to the fact that the technical folks are often speaking a completely different language to us. So it can be tough to kind of translate that good practice into action for us non-technical folks. So this is why it's really my pleasure to be able to share PaCSON's annual collective awareness raising campaign, where we've established together 4 easy steps where all of us, everyone of all technical capabilities can up your cybersecurity. And Sam will walk us through those 4 key steps, as well as introduce a really important topic, both globally, but increasingly in the region, which is the focus on ransomware, which is something that's been affecting more and more organizations, particularly small and medium enterprises. So that's what Sam will get into a bit more in depth later. But I just want to give a quick intro into our campaign and into the PaCSON network, the group that was able to come up with these materials. So as Barbara mentioned, PaCSON is a regional incident response network. We are the Pacific Cybersecurity Operational Network, and we're made up of 16 members across the region, and it's really a point of contact network for incidents. It's an operational network. It's all about information sharing, good practice sharing, collaboration, and capacity building. Much like our counterparts in the Asia Pacific, Africa, and elsewhere, we aren't a direct incident response team, but we're a network of incident response points of contact. So it's all about collaboration and working together to get things done. The slide should be changing.
Sorry, Clay,
Yes.
I've just taken over your presentation there. Sorry about that. I'll click through for you.
Next slide, please. No worries. So like I mentioned, our community is quite diverse. We have points of contact in Australia, the Cook Islands, Fiji, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, of course, us in New Zealand, Niue, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, the Solomon Islands, Tokelau, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu, as well as partners based in Fiji and the US. Those are our official members, but much like Business Link Pacific, we rely on the community as a whole, all sectors and everyone to get involved and help raise cybersecurity awareness as well as cybersecurity capability across the region. Next slide, please, Barbara. So just a little look into our structure. We have an excellent executive committee that we vote on. So the current chair is CERT Tonga, obviously in Tonga. Our new deputy chair is the Cook Islands. And our incoming chair is the team at CERT Vanuatu, who are also awareness raising working group. We have a very capable PaCSON secretariat that helps us out. They're based in Australia. And we kind of started this year a new range of working groups that allow us to do even more. So the campaign we're going to talk about today is run through the awareness raising working group, which is chaired by CERT Vanuatu. The Capacity Building Working Group, where we run all sorts of activities, including regular webinars similar to this one, is chaired by us at CertNZ. The Comms Working Group and the PaCSON Partner Working Group are also both chaired by Australia, the ACSC over there. Next slide, please. So as you mentioned, the working groups are kind of the core of how we work. There are technical and non-technical focuses. And when push comes to shove, we are a network of members. We're all about collaborating, and we rely really on each member to work with their local and regional partners to make things happen. So that could be Business Link Pacific. We've also built stronger relationships with AP CERT, the Asia Pacific kind of equivalent of PaCSON, Cyber Safety Pacifica, whom some of you may have heard of, more of a law enforcement network, Pylon for more of the policy side, and partners all across the community, whether they're community groups, individual trainers and experts, and just bringing everyone together to build a wider cybersecurity ecosystem across the Pacific. And we're really excited to work with you guys today. As a little bit of background before we get into the interesting stuff with Sam, CyberSmart Pacific is, as I mentioned, the annual awareness raising campaign developed through the Awareness Working Group. And it's something that we started out last year. This is just our second year, and we're really excited by the uptake that has happened this year. And we're really pleased that we're able to finish off International Cyber Awareness Month with all of you. It's really important that you guys are able to take these steps and implement them yourselves, but also hopefully spread the good message to the rest of your community to help us all together build the resilience of the Pacific region. So enough background. Let's get into the good stuff and the robots. Take it away, Sam.
Cool. Thank you, Clay. And thanks again, Barbara, for the introduction. With that, we can move straight on to the next slide, which should be the contents. So as Clay covered, I'll just be talking about the Cyber Up initiative and the 4 key messages within that, as well as the Cyber Up materials that are available for anyone to use. And then we'll get into ransomware, which I personally think is a really important topic to discuss, especially in terms of business audiences. And then lastly, we'll have a slide that just has some key regional contact websites and useful websites for everyone here. After that, we'll have a section for any questions anyone might have. But as Barbara said, if you do have anything pressing, feel free to use that little function to raise your hand, and we will try to get to that as quick as we can. So next slide, please. Great. So Cyber Up, we're calling everyone to Cyber Up, and that means skilling up and increasing our awareness and knowledge when it comes to cybersecurity issues, with a specific focus on these 4 simple steps within the Cyber Up initiative to become more cyber secure. Security threats are constantly on the rise, so we also need to lift our collective knowledge and awareness so that we can all stay safe online. So the next slide, great. That's our 4 hero robots there who champion the 4 key messages of the Cyber Up initiative. As you can see listed there, the 4 key messages are upsizing passwords, upgrading to 2-factor authentication, upholding privacy, and updating devices and apps. And we will get into each one of those on a bit more of a detailed level. I do just want to make a note that these are tips that are relevant for everyone, individuals all the way up to big businesses. And usually they are implemented on an individual level. But if every individual in a business can implement these 4 simple steps, then that business's overall cybersecurity and resilience will improve across the board. So let's get straight into it with the first one, which is upsizing passwords. This is our red robot. And what we're talking about here with this key messages is making your passwords harder for attackers to crack through making them longer, stronger, and unique, or using a password manager, which we'll get into. So next slide, please. So these are the key points within this step. So firstly, we're talking about changing your password. This is in instances where you might have a weak password. Weak passwords are pretty easy for attackers to crack using brute force techniques. So ensuring that your passwords are unique, long, and strong is a great way to protect yourself online and protect your online information. So first key message is to change passwords anywhere where you might have a weak password. Next, we have to make each password unique. So as you can imagine, if you use the same password across all your online accounts, if that password were to be compromised or caught up in a data breach, then all your online accounts using that password are at risk of being compromised as well. So the next key point is to make sure that each of your passwords are unique, so that if one happens to be compromised, not all your online accounts will be as well. The next point is to keep your passwords safe. So here we're actually recommending to use a password manager. What this piece of software does, stores all your passwords in one place and allows you to simply remember one master password to access them. This does raise its own concerns that have come up in this space regularly. So what happens if that one master password were to be compromised? Unfortunately, there would be access to all the accounts where that password is kept. However, I think the benefit of password managers in this space is that it allows you to focus all your energy and your effort towards ensuring that that one master password is top-notch, really long, really secure, really strong and unique, not likely to be brute forced or cracked through any social media information or anything like that. So it allows you to focus on that one password and just remember one password to keep all your other passwords safe. The next point that we have is not using your personal information in your password. So we're talking about things like your name, whether your first or last, or maybe your mum's maiden name, a pet's name, a partner's name, dates of birth for your loved ones. All of these are password no-nos, essentially because often that information can be found online by attackers. So they could scrape social media and online accounts for this kind of information, enter that into a brute force algorithm, and if you are using that personal information in your passwords, it may make those a bit easier to crack for attackers. So making sure that your password doesn't include any of that personal information is really important as well. And last but certainly not least is the crux, is making those passwords long and strong. So one example of a strong password is just there at the bottom, and that's actually correct horse battery staple. That might seem a little bit weird, but the benefit of this password is that it's 4 random words that aren't related to each other, aren't related to your personal information at all. There's over 20 characters there, and it can be pretty easy for you to remember if you just come up with a little mnemonic for the 4 words, but it's also really hard for attackers to crack. Like I say, the words aren't related to each other in any way, so it's not easy for them to get in to your accounts if your password is something like a passphrase of 4 or more words. And that wraps up the upsizing passwords hero. So we'll move on to upgrading to two-factor authentication. Hopefully most people here know what two-factor authentication is. Essentially, it just gives you an extra layer of security for your online accounts when you're logging in, and just adds that extra layer of defense. So let's look at that a little bit more in depth. So again, two-factor authentication gives you an additional way of identifying who you are and adds an extra layer of security in addition to your password that you already have. So in the event that you're using a two-factor authentication, let's say your password was caught in a data breach or was compromised, even with your username and password, if you have two-factor authentication enabled, an attacker won't be able to get into your accounts because they won't be able to pass that two-factor authentication layer. So usually two-factor authentication looks like a code that you'll get through a third-party app or through another device like your phone. You enter that code into the online account you're logging into, and as long as they match, you'll be able to get in. It's often also known as two-step authentication or multi-factor authentication, but essentially they're all adding that extra layer of authentication before you are able to log into your account, which is an extra layer to keep you safe. So one of the key messages here is to turn on two-factor authentication for all of your important accounts. And in this particular instance, I recommend starting with the really top priority ones. So your financial information, your online banking accounts, turning on two-factor authentication there, and then for things like your email accounts and your social media, and just starting at the top of that priority list and working your way down is the best way to tackle that. It's also really important to be mindful that if you are using two-factor authentication, the device you use for that two-factor authentication essentially becomes its own form of password or key. So just making sure that you're keeping those devices safe and on your person. If it's your phone, that's usually the case, so they tend to be nice and safe. But just being aware that your phone or whatever device you're using for two-factor is now essentially a set of keys or another password. And then the last but really important point here is to watch out for any rogue codes in terms of two-factor. If you haven't attempted to log into an account, but you've received a code, generally this is a good sign that someone has your password and is trying to log in there. So if that ever happens, jumping straight onto that site and changing your account password is the best step there. And that wraps up two-factor. So we'll move on to the next one, which is upholding privacy. So when we're talking about upholding privacy, we're talking about all your personal information that might be online and who can see what information you are sharing. So if we break that down into some key steps on the next slide. So basically protecting your privacy, like I say, this is things that you share on social media that could be used by attackers to steal your identity or try to get into your online accounts. So it's being mindful and careful about what you're sharing online and who can see what you're sharing. So in that regard, changing your privacy settings on your social media accounts is really important. Typically, we recommend that you change this to only allowing friends and family to see what you're posting, but that might change depending on number of variables, your workplace, your role, and your public position might determine that you need to have those privacy settings set to something different. So just being aware to what they are set to and who can see what you're posting is really important. And also in that same kind of track, only accepting invitations and requests from people you know in real life, from profiles that you know to be those people is really important. Anyone can send a friend request to anyone usually, so just making sure you know who you're accepting and who your friends are is super important. We also recommend to avoid oversharing. Again, if you have that kind of personal information on your online accounts that are used for your passwords, potentially security questions, which you might see as the next step down, that information could be used by attackers to try and
Okay, Sam, we seem to have lost you there. Clay, are you still with us? Okay, Clay or Sam, are you joined on a different device by the looks? Are you on mute?
Sorry, when did I cut out exactly?
You've just pretty much finished that last slide.
Avoiding oversharing?
Yeah.
Cool. So the last point here. Yeah, just a quick note on those security questions. That is another potential avenue for attackers to get into your accounts. As you all probably know, if you aren't able to remember your password, a way to reset your password is by entering answers to your personally selected security questions. So again, if you have a public presence on social media and things like that, being sure that you're not sharing that personal information that might be the answers to your security questions online is really important, or likewise making sure security questions you choose, the answers aren't anywhere online that you've already posted. And that wraps up upholding privacy. So we'll move on to updating devices and apps. So here we're talking about patching your software, essentially, making sure that your operating systems, whether it's on your mobile phone or your laptop, and your software, whether it's a mobile app or a piece of software on your laptop, are all up to date. It's really important to keep bugs and viruses out and protect yourself from software vulnerabilities. So if we move to the next slide, we'll get a little bit deeper in. So again, cyber threats are constantly changing, and having up-to-date operating systems, apps, and software is really key and important to defend against viruses and vulnerabilities. Updates often add new features, but that's not all that they're for. They're also about fixing vulnerabilities in software and OS, and keeping attackers from being able to exploit those vulnerabilities. So we recommend that anytime you have an update available for your operating system or any of your software, that you install it right away, or better yet, actually setting those updates to install automatically is great, because that way you don't have to think about it and you're ensured to have the latest security updates as soon as they're available. And last but not least, just a recommendation to only keep the apps that you require. If you've got a bunch of software on your laptop that you don't use for your daily work, that you don't actually need, the safest thing is just to get rid of any software that you're not using. That way you're not at risk of any vulnerabilities or exploits that software might have. And that wraps up the 4 heroes and the 4 key messages. But what's really important about the Cyber Up initiative is getting it out to as many people as we can. Friends, family, colleagues, customers, clients, all of the above. The farther and wider we can spread the good message, the better. and there's some key materials to help that message be spread, which I believe is all available through the Business Link website. But those materials include a 15-second video covering the CyberUp initiative, posters, flyers, social and web tiles, and screensavers as well. Like I say, I believe that's all available on the Business Link website, but if anyone has any trouble, there is plenty of people, including Clay and myself, that you can reach out to get access to that info. And if we move to the next slide, now we're moving on to ransomware. I'm aware that some people might have questions about the CyberUp stuff. Feel free to ask questions now or keep them to the end. I'll leave that up to you. But if there's nothing pressing, we'll get straight into ransomware. So we'll just talk a little bit about what ransomware is, how it gets into the system, and what impacts it can have on a business, because they can be quite devastating and destructive to businesses who aren't prepared for a ransomware attack. I think it's really important to talk about in this kind of setting. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what ransomware is. It's essentially malicious software or malware that infects a system and denies access to files or the computer system itself, unless a victim pays a ransom, which is usually requested in Bitcoin. What we've been seeing lately is that ransomware attacks can sometimes include a second wave or additional threats, where attackers threaten to release exfiltrated data from the system that they infected online unless that victim pays the ransom. Our advice is always to never pay a ransom. Unfortunately, there's no guarantee that paying that will get you access to your systems and data back, and it kind of makes the ransomware attacks a more lucrative and appealing attack for those malicious actors. So that's always our advice, but we can absolutely understand that for a business, that might seem like their only option, but we'll talk about a few other things that a business can do to keep themselves safe from ransomware. And it's also really important to note that anyone can be targeted from ransomware. If you're online, if you have data, if you have client services, that disruption would cause significant damage, you're definitely at risk from a ransomware attack. So let's move on to the next slide, and we'll see a really great diagram that another CERT employee created not too long ago. And this essentially covers the life cycle of a ransomware. So starting from the initial access, how the ransomware affects the system, all the way through to what kind of impact that has on business. And you'll see there's little shapes in between. And these relate to our 10 critical controls. So that's another piece of material we have here at CERT New Zealand. And it's very similar to the 4 key messages of CyberUp, in the sense that there are 10 easy steps that anyone can take to keep themselves a little bit safer. But there are a few additional tips in there that is more specific and technical for business kind of audiences. What I will do is talk to the 10 critical controls that directly relate with the 4 key messages of CyberUp and where they come into on this diagram. But I'll also talk about a couple more that are present on the 10 critical controls list, because I think they're really, really important for protecting against ransomware, and particularly one which I think is probably the most important thing a business can do. We'll get into that as well. We'll break it down, and we'll start by looking at the initial access slides. If you can skip to that. All right, thank you. So this is the initial access phase. So this is how the attacker infiltrates the system, how they get in and infect it with ransomware. So there's a few different ways that an attacker could do this. And one of the most simple ways is through phishing. So a phishing email that links you to a phishing site. If an employee happened to enter their credentials into that phishing site, their credentials would be scraped and then compromised, and an attacker could use said credentials to get into your systems through your internet exposed systems. The next is password guessing, which is essentially brute force and kind of relates quite well to what we were talking about previously with personal information being online. Attackers can brute force weak passwords very easily, and if your password is made up of some personal information that you have online, then they can use those social medias and things to scrape that info and potentially guess your password. And again, that flows on to them being able to access the system, get in and infect it with ransomware. Next is the exploitation of software weaknesses. And this relates really closely to the patching and updating your apps and devices that we were talking about. Lots of software out there, so obviously there's going to be vulnerabilities and weaknesses popping up. Updating is the best way to ensure you're protected against that. And last but certainly not least is malicious emails. So what we're talking about here is emails that contain a malicious attachment or a malicious document or something like that. And if an employee happened to click on it, download it, or open it, it could potentially deliver a malware payload and infect the system with ransomware. Now, Barbara, if you actually wouldn't mind going back to the previous slide really quickly, I just want to touch on the critical controls and how they relate to the initial access phase here. So you'll see the little black shape after the password guessing. This signifies the use of a password manager. So relating back to the cyber up tips, if you can implement a password manager, even if an attacker was able to compromise your password through brute force or social engineering tactics, they wouldn't be able to breach that two-factor authentication layer. They wouldn't be able to guess your password because the password manager ensures that you're set up with a really long and strong password that is near impossible to brute force, or would at least take millions of years to do so. That's the importance of a password manager and how it relates to ransomware. You will see I think it's purple after username and password, a little purple shape, which signifies the use of multi-factor authentication. So this is what I was getting at just before, where if your credentials happen to be compromised or caught up in a data breach, or they were able to brute force your password, they still wouldn't be able to get into the system because they can't breach that second layer, that two-factor authentication layer of defense. Then coming down to exploitation of software weaknesses, you'll see the orange shape, which relates to patching. And this is pretty much exactly what we were talking about with updating your devices and operating systems, just ensuring that operating system and software are always updated. The latest update will ensure that they've got the latest security updates and are protected against any known vulnerabilities. Now, one other one I wanted to talk about, which you'll see appearing pretty much everywhere on this diagram, is the teal color, just after malicious documents. And what this signifies, it's after every channel. What this signifies is alerting and logging. So the benefit of setting up alerting and logging in terms of ransomware, and again, you'll see it present in every different phase of a ransomware. The benefit is to be able to set up those alerts for any malicious or suspicious or unauthorized network activity, so that you can sort of see what's happening in the first instance, jump onto your network and potentially block anything further from occurring. And logging is really important as well. If, for example, malware was able to get into your system, you've got a good logging system set up, you'll be able to see where that initially got in, likely be able to figure out whose email address and just approach it and make sure that that's not likely to happen again, so that you're protected from that initial infection vector in the future. So we'll move on to the columns consolidation and preparation phase. One quick note I'll make in terms of the overall diagram is as we move from left to right, we're moving along a time scale, but it's really important to note that often attackers, and it's pretty typical for them to do so, they'll sit within a system and a lot of time can actually pass before they launch any kind of attack. So they might actually infiltrate the system, sit within there for a month, and that time period, that month that they're sitting in that system, that's the part that we're talking about now. So they've gotten into the system, they've taken control. What do they do from there? Typically, they'll attempt to infect other devices that are connected to the system that they've infected, to pretty much cover as many as they can to make the ransom more appealing to pay. And they'll also try to get full access to the system and the data that's stored there. So they might sit in the system for a little while and try to move laterally and see what else they can access. And then they move on to actually launching the attack. So quickly, we'll go back to the original diagram again, if you don't mind, Barbara. And as you can see, critical controls are there again. Logging and alerting appears, multi-factor authentication appears, and patching appears as well. So you can see how really important those things are. Again, patching to make sure you're not at risk of those software vulnerabilities. Logging and alerting to have a sort of paper trail of what happened and have some alerts popping up when things do start happening. And multi-factor authentication just to have that extra layer of protection for everyone's credentials. So we'll move on to impact on the target, which is the really, really important information, I think, especially for this audience. So what actually happens if your system was to be ransomware? Essentially, what we all know ransomware does is it locks down your systems, locks down your data, so you can't access anything unless you pay that ransom. That's right at the bottom there, along the encrypt the data line. What they also try to do is steal business data, so exfiltrate your data. As I talked about earlier, it's not always in a second wave. They might, in the initial ransom demand, say, you don't have access unless you pay this ransom, and additionally, we're going to release this information online if you don't pay this ransom. And you can imagine how impactful that could be for a business. If you're a business that keeps personal information in a database about your clients or your customers, if that was to be leaked online, that would cause some really significant, could cause some really significant reputational damage for businesses and organizations, as well as the operational damage that being ransomware causes as well. And then the third one there is destroying backups. Now, this is quite a particular point. So having a backup for your system is what I think is probably the most important step a business can take to protect themselves from ransomware. Now, it is a reactive approach, unfortunately, but what having a backup will allow you to do, if your system is ransomware and it's locked down, you can activate your backup, back up the system, reset it to your backup, and then you can get back up and running, get back up and running with hopefully as little disruption to your business as possible. Some really key points on those backups and where destroying backups comes into this is it's important to keep those backups in a different place, on a different system, on a different server, whatever it is, to your main operational server. If you keep it in the same place, your main operational server is ransomware, then obviously your backups are caught up in that as well, and they're not very useful to you at that point. So keeping them in a different place and establishing and maintaining them on a good regular basis is key as well. You get ransomware when you backed up 2 days ago, then you're looking pretty good. You can back up straight away and get on back up and running. Again, hopefully as little disruption as possible. So if we head back to that main diagram again, please, Barbara, we'll have a look at the critical controls that come into play in terms of the impact on the target. Cool, thank you. So this is where the orange critical control comes in just before the destroying backups impact, but I actually think that this can be applied to every one of those impacts. If you can have a backup again, you can ideally get back up and running with as little disruption as possible. And then you've also got logging and alerting appearing there as well. Again, just super important to have that trail to be able to figure out what happened so you can protect against that in the future, and also have some alerts popping up for any sort of malicious or suspicious activity, so ideally stop it before it happens. Now that pretty much wraps up what I have to say about ransomware there. So if we move along to the last slide, I believe it's a slide that contains some key regional contacts. Sorry, one more, that's one. So key regional contacts for the region. As you can see, lots of different certs on there, PaCSON, Business Link Pacific. These slides should be available for anyone who's wanting them after the presentation. So there's just some useful links in there for anyone who needs them. You head to the next slide. This is just us saying thank you for stepping up your cybersecurity and cybering up with us. We're here to help you, your businesses, your customers, your community be safe online. So please get in touch if there's anything you want to discuss. You can see Clay's email down at the bottom there, along with mine, and there's also the link for PaCSON members there as well. But yeah, thanks again for everyone for coming along and listening to what I had to say. If anyone has any questions, now's a good time to raise them, and I'll do my best.
Thanks so much, Sam. Wow, that was an excellent presentation, and I love your diagrams. I love your bots, and I think your map, your diagram was absolutely fantastic. What a great way of codifying what happened. So thank you so much for sharing that and making it all sound so simple for us.
I believe that diagram is also available on the Business Link website as well.
Oh, that's excellent. No, it's a really, really clear way of showing just what happens and the impacts along the way. So participants, any questions? Whilst we've got Clay and Sam with us in this chat room, you've got a lot of expertise there. Any particular questions that you want to ask them whilst we've got the opportunity? Sam, I've got a question. Just you spoke about backups.
Yep.
What's your recommendation? I mean, obviously there's various different places that you can back up to, and you did say it needs to be somewhere different to your usual system. What's your view on using an external hard drive or one of those plug-in devices to back up your information on?
Yeah, the way you back up will change depending on your business and the kind of data you have, how much data you have. I mean, if you can get an external hard drive which covers your system and more, then you're probably okay using that. There's also third-party services you can use, so cloud storage for backups and things like that. That's a good way to ensure that it's kept in a different location. And then alternatively, if neither of those work for you, if you have multiple servers, that's another way that you can do that by making sure your operational server's on one, your backups are stored on another, and that's another way to keep you safe. But as long as an external hard drive is ensured to be kept in a safe location as well, and it has enough space for your systems to cover everything and maybe a little bit more, I think that's an okay way to go about it.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I suppose the other thing is that sometimes those external hard drives they kind of fail after a while, don't they? They're not that great. I know
they can run into general wear and tear that all mechanical sort of hardware eventually does. So that might make cloud storage a little bit more ideal for you. I did see a little question pop up.
Yeah. Tim's asking a question around backup services. So what kind of cloud backup services do you recommend as opposed to physical servers?
So being a government employee, I actually can't make any specific recommendations about any particular companies or anything like that. My general advice would be to just make sure that they're a reputable company. I mean, we all know the big names, so any of them will definitely help you. But just doing a little bit of online research to make sure it's a reputable company, has good reviews, has good security, hasn't been caught up in many data breaches in the past. Those are all good things to check before utilizing a service. I see there was another question. If your data is stored in the cloud, do you need to back up what is in the cloud? It's a good question. I believe that the differing backup or cloud storage services that are offered, they also have things along those lines where they offer a backup to your backup, which seems a bit, where does it stop? I definitely don't think it's bad practice at all to have a backup of your cloud backup, if at all possible. If you have the operational capacity to do so, then by all means, and then if the cloud backup was to ever go down, you've got the on-site hands-on backup, or even vice versa. Your hands-on on-site backup is your main one, and then your cloud backup is your reserve. I think using both of those is a good practice if you have the capacity for it and funding for it.
And I suppose this is where, having really sound protocols around how you name your backups and how you label them becomes absolutely critical. I know for one organisation I worked for, we had daily backups and then we had monthly backups. And, we need to be really clear which was which and what was saved where.
So even running those multiple streams of backups is a good idea as well. I mean, not everyone's going to be able to back up daily. They might not have the operational capacity for that, but the more often you can, the more often you can update your backup, the better. It's just, it'll just depend on your capabilities.
Okay, and Loretta's also got a question around how can I keep my hard drive backup secure from any impacts?
So if you're using like an external hard drive, as long as that's not plugged into any servers or networks, as it's kept off any networks, then that should be secure from any kind of online impacts or malware impacts. If you're keeping that plugged into devices and networks and servers and things like that, then it's probably also at risk of anything that infects that server or that network. So my recommendation would be to back up to the hard drive, remove it from the network and the server, and then keep it in a physically secure location.
So that physical security is probably equally an important issue there, isn't it? Making sure that it's not going to get damaged, making sure it's not going to get stolen. Yeah,
and often cybersecurity can run hand in hand with some physical security things. I mean, I'm sure we're all made aware of tailgating when we have to use cards to get into doors and things like that. So, and that relates back to using your device for your two-factor authentication and just ensuring the device is kept safe as well. There is some physical security that comes into this. So yeah, keeping that physical hard drive back up in a safe or a locked drawer, something like that is practice.
Great. Any other questions, anyone? Okay, I just have another question around the two-factor authentication. Can you kind of explain, or what sort of apps are out there? What systems are out there, and are there any that you could choose from, or do they do they tend to just come with the kind of software that you're implementing?
So it'll depend on the platform that you're trying to activate two-factor authentication for. So, for example, let's take Facebook as a case. I believe you can get sent a code to your mobile phone, your mobile number, or you can get emailed a code. So it changes depending on the platform, and you can sort of tailor it to choose which one suits you best. There are third-party applications, authenticator applications that make it a little bit easier. I know that Google has one, and I think Microsoft has one as well, and there's lots out there. But this just using one of those will sort of bottleneck all of that into one channel. So if the platform allows for it, then all your two-factor authentication will be done through that third-party app.
Right. Yes, I noticed with my accounting software that there's an app that I had to download, which an authenticator app, which
Yep.
I use to access my accounting software. And then I noticed that there's another app that I use, another platform that I use. It uses the same authenticator, but I don't have any choice about that, do I? That those the particular software is the decider about which app to use.
Yeah, and like Facebook, taking Facebook as another example, I believe they do it themselves. So platforms might offer their own two-factor authentication service, or opt to allow you to do it through a third-party device. It just depends on the platform that you're wanting to activate that on. But typically, all your two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication settings can be found generally under your account settings or security settings or privacy settings. So looking for those is a good way to find them, or just using the search function and look for that two-factor or multi-factor or two-step authentication should help you pull that up for that particular platform.
Great. No, thank you, Sam. Any other questions, anyone? Now, I noticed that, Jeff, I think you've just managed to get in and join us just before we're finishing. But hey, look, I'm so sorry that you haven't been able to join us earlier, Jeff. But thank you for coming in now. And I did just want to invite you, if there's anything that you want to add. Challenging thing to do, I know. But I was just wondering, perhaps if you'd like to come in and say something about your role at PaCSON. Are you still there, Jeff? Jeff, I think you're on mute.
Hi.
Hi there. Thank you for joining us. I know you got called away.
My apologies for not joining earlier. I've been called to another meeting, but I guess Sam and the team has covered pretty much everything. But in terms of your question, in relation to PaCSON, Vanuatu has been nominated the convener of the awareness working group. And since 2019, I believe, until now, we have been taking the lead in trying to promote awareness from a regional perspective. I must say that I think the first year of that wasn't too good, but as we progress along last year and this year especially, we've kind of improved or even done a bit more in terms of awareness raising. It is yet a big challenge, but we're just thankful that through a platform like PaCSON and working together with a lot of brilliant people across the region to actually push cybersecurity awareness, it is something that is paying off, well, at least for the countries who have involved, especially in the Cyber App Week, has actually done a lot in that. And I think they are, from a national perspective, within the different island countries in the Pacific, I think they are quite happy with their progress in terms of the Cyber App campaign. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. No, thank you, Jeff. And I just want to say, the certs around the Pacific are fantastic resources for business. the CERT organisation, of course, that's the Cybersecurity Emergency Response Teams, and most of the countries in the Pacific, am I right, Clay, have got a CERT. Well, certainly I know Vanuatu, Tonga, PNG, I think, and obviously New Zealand. There's a number of them around the Pacific which play a critical role in keeping us all safe from cybersecurity.
Yeah, Clay actually had to step out, unfortunately, but there's a really great website, Firstorg, which is just kind of a registry of security, cybersecurity emergency response teams and security incident response teams and things like that. And it just kind of lists all the ones around the world. So if anyone was curious if a particular country or anything had a cert, using First.org is a great way to find that out.
No, that's great. And yeah, I mean, I think you guys really come to the fore when we have big issues that take place. Like I recall recently the big issue that happened with one of our district health boards, I think it was, and you guys stepped in straight away and tried to deal with that. But that was pretty major, you know, a huge breach to security, patient data, patient information, and that was a ransomware issue, I believe, wasn't it, Sam?
Yeah, and the operational impacts of that can't be understated. I know that people had to be referred to other hospitals and things like that, so treatment plans were interrupted and whatnot. So huge operational impacts, and that was a ransomware attack. So hopefully some people can walk away with some key tips to protect themselves from ransomware and won't fall victim to the same thing.
Yes, as you were showing us your diagram and walking through that diagram, I was thinking of that particular case and just how, you know, I think they probably sat on their information. They got access to the systems and sat on the information for quite a while before they actually did anything, huh?
Yeah, very, very likely. It's pretty typical of attackers to do that. They will spend.
Okay, I think we've lost you again, Sam. So this is when it comes down to, it comes back to me holding the fort with a topic that I'm not particularly comfortable with. But hey, I think we've covered this really well. Are you back with us again, Sam?
I can hear you. I'm not sure if you guys can hear me.
I can hear you. That's good. I thought I was going to be left in the lurch there holding the
Sorry
fort
about that.
with us. But hey, you've done a great job with explaining all of these concepts to us and certainly giving us lots of tips for keeping safe online. Are there any other questions before we sign out? Okay, and I do believe that we will be able to make the presentation available as well afterwards. So thank you so much. Sam, any final comments from you before we finish up?
No, hey, look, just another thank you to everyone for coming along and for the invite to come along and present and talk to you all. Cybersecurity is a joint effort, really. We all need to improve our cyber resilience and security as individuals and as businesses. So if we can all work together, we can all become more cyber secure.
That's absolutely right. And of course, you know, with us all working from home and working remotely, it's increasingly an important issue for us. So very pertinent, very timely, and fantastic information that you've shared today. So, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This has been great having an extra webinar, and yeah, I hope you've all gained something from it. So thanks very much, and look forward to seeing you again at our next scheduled webinar, which will be next month in November. I think we're looking at either the 2nd or 3rd, probably the 3rd Thursday of the month, and we'll continue on with our business advisor skills topic. So thank you very much, everyone, and look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.